Hi everyone, it's Bennet, one of the co-hosts of Theory Night in Canada. I'm back with part 2 of the summary series of Marx's Capital, Volume 1. I'd like to apologize for the lack of regular episode this week. One of the hosts isn't available, and we don't have a guest lined up. Regular programming will resume Wednesday. Until then, enjoy this scripted content. So, we left off last time establishing several definitions. I'd recommend viewing or even reviewing the first video if you weren't paying attention, because I will be referencing concepts without re-explaining them. This time, we're going to explain how the circulation of commodities and commodity production itself allows the expansion of money value. In Part 2, the transformation of money into capital. So the first chapter of Part 2 is the general formula for capital. The general formula for capital is right here at the top of the slide, MCM. Astute observers will notice that this is very similar to the circulation of commodities formula established in Part 1. That's because this is the direct inverse of that formula. Instead of selling a commodity to buy another commodity, we're buying a commodity to sell it again. In other words, CMC is selling something we don't need for something we want, selling in order to buy, and MCM is buying something we don't need to sell it again, or buying in order to sell. The basic circulation formula CMC is essentially reducible to CC prime, or the direct exchange of one commodity for another commodity. Similarly, MCM is reducible to MM prime, or transforming one quantity of money into another quantity of money. This seems odd, but we'll explain how this works in this part of the book. Besides the surface level differences between the basic circulation formula and the general formula for capital, there are also some non-superficial differences. Firstly, when we sell in order to buy, it's because we have a commodity we don't want and want to acquire a commodity we don't have in order to fill an unmet need. Once CMC terminates, there is no reason for the agent to resell C prime. Otherwise, why even buy it? From the perspective of the initial seller, the commodity circuit ends in one circulation. On the other hand, when money is expended in order to expand its value, the initial spender gets more money to spend. The circuit, therefore, can wheel on eternally from the perspective of the initial buyer. Secondly, the CMC circuit exists to allow the exchange of use values. The MCM circuit, on the other hand, exists only to augment exchange values. When we assign the label M prime to the second M in the MCM circuit, it's shorthand for the formula on screen. M prime equals M, the initial money invested, plus delta M, where delta M is the augmentation of that initial investment, which Marx refers to as surplus value. Beyond the fact of the difference in basic form, the general formula for capital has another key distinction from the basic circuit of commodity exchange. In MCM prime, more money is withdrawn than is originally spent into circulation. Not so with CMC prime, where the understanding is that a commodity or commodities of equivalent money value to the original sold commodity have been withdrawn. Now, are CNC prime necessarily equal in exchange value? No. It is, of course, always possible that someone buys a commodity on clearance or sells more dearly than they are owed, but this is not the case on average. Besides, even when there is an unbalance in CMC, the circuit does not lose all meaning. That is, it is not necessarily defined by being equal. MCM prime, on the other hand, is defined by being unequal. It is defined by this extraction of a surplus value. Capital expansion is the point of MCM prime. If capital expansion does not occur, then the owner of the money capital would never expose it to the danger of circulation, as that would risk loss. Returning to our earlier point, when we said that a CMC circuit terminates in one circulation from the perspective of the original seller, while an MCM circuit does not, we can see the distinction between a commodity and capital. and money capital, that is, a capitalist, when they receive money back from value expansion, does not need to then hoard the money received. The money received from the sale becomes the nucleus for further geometric expansion of capital. Beyond being a simple commodity producer, in inverting the circuit of commodity production, the capitalist is able to expand their capital infinitely and forever. The circulation of capital is limitless. Now, because the commodity purchased to sell again for value expansion is not needed by the capitalist to fill a use value, the C in MCM is just as much capital as the M's are. Instead of being money capital, the commodity in the general formula takes on the characteristics of commodity capital. It is just the latent form between M and M prime. As Marx himself puts it on page 171 of my edition, capital is money, capital is commodities. This chapter establishes as close to a concise definition of capitalism as Marx will get into in Volume 1. Capitalism is synonymous and inseparable with what Marxists would call commodity production. That is, the production of commodities for the purpose of augmenting money capital. Alright, we got sucked into the weeds a little with that chapter, but let's zoom out here in the second chapter of Part 2. Contradictions in the general formula of capital. Does MCM even make sense to the same degree that CMC does? Marx claims so, but he says it shouldn't. Really, the simplified form of MCM we've been discussing only accurately describes the way merchant and finance capital works, which are merely subsets of the capitalist system of production. Marx says the point of this book is not to go into those things, and that they will be discussed later. I'm telling you to take his word for it, but the discussion of merchant capital and finance capital will be not discussed in this volume. Beyond the case of a merchant whose job it is to facilitate long-distance transport of a commodity from a seller to a foreign buyer, why would MCM even be allowed to happen? Imagine if we had a producer A and a consumer B. If the product of A is produced locally, why would B ever buy from our capitalist middleman instead of directly from the producer for less? The surplus value in M prime does not come from the act of exchange. In the case of merchant capital, it comes from something else, the labor inherent in the transport process, which we can get into if I ever summarize Volume 2 of Capital. If capitalists were extracting surplus value from simply reselling commodities, they would either need some kind of protected monopoly, or they wouldn't be able to get away with it for long. Since capitalism doesn't generally work this way, there must be some other source of surplus value generation. At the time Marx was writing, there had been several attempts to assign the source of surplus value incorrectly by classical economists. The first of these Marx addresses in the idea that commodities are consistently sold above or below their value. This can, individually, be the case, as we have already said, but it cannot possibly be the case on average. Due to pressure from competition, the exchange value of an individual commodity under normal conditions can't on average be higher than the labor value modified by the supply and demand relation. Across the board, on the other hand, if all commodities were sold at or above their value, say at 10% higher than their correct value given the present conditions, it would be no different than simply denominating money lower. The relative values of commodities would remain unchanged, even if there was a nominal difference in price. The second argument Marx addresses is the truly baffling proposition, put forward and endorsed by some of his contemporaries, that there existed two segregated groups in the market economy: producers who produce everything, and consumers who only passively buy. The argument for this is much weaker than the previous idea, and immediately falls apart on close inspection. Where do the consumers get their money from? How does this allow value expansion? Really, the fact that economists were advancing this idea shows that they were either incredibly stupid or willfully blind to the true source of surplus value due to the implications of what we're about to expose. Ultimately, surplus value and value expansion need to come from somewhere. If they don't, capitalism, the general formula for capital, is impossible. Capitalist commodity production as a model wouldn't work as a form of social organization because on average there would be no returns from it. There would be no value expansion. Having established that, we've also shown that surplus value does not come from the movement of money by itself, and does not come from cheating the purchaser by selling above the true value. I've been keeping it a bit mysterious, but anyone even passingly familiar with Marx knows where I'm going with this. So let's move on to the next chapter. The last chapter in part 2 is the buying and selling of labor power. In this chapter, Marx pulls the curtain off the mystery box of surplus value. So let's get right into it. Recall the general formula for capital, MCM prime. Somewhere in this circuit, value expansion occurs, allowing the capitalists to withdraw more money from circulation than they initially invested. It can't be in the second part of the circuit, CM prime, as this just entails the conversion of the commodity into its equivalent exchange value. We've already shown that on average, surplus value does not come from commerce. Therefore, it must be in the first half of the circuit, MC. The capitalist purchases some commodity, and the purchase and consumption of that commodity allows him to gain more than he initially expended. This is a departure from the language and conventions we have used earlier, in which the capitalist purchases commodity C just to resell it. But the secret to capitalist success is that the C they sell in the second half of the circuit is not the same commodity that they initially purchased with their investment. Instead, they purchase a separate commodity, which is then consumed to produce the final commodity for sale. The solution to the mystery is labor power. Marx defines labor power in this chapter as the aggregate of mental and physical capabilities peculiar to a human being which they can use to create use values. Essentially, using your hands and your brain, you are able to make things that you or someone else has a use for. This capacity under capitalism itself becomes a commodity. In fact, it must be a commodity. Workers are essentially commodity producers, but the commodity they bring to the market for sale is their own labor power. In order for labor power to be a commodity available for purchase, there needs to be a set of conditions and social relations already in place. The first is that there needs to be a class of people who are free to sell their labor, i.e., not slaves, serfs, or some other kind of bonded servant. Without the existence of a class of constitutionally free laborers, the high supply of the labor power commodity, and therefore affordable price of it, is not guaranteed. Or even stable price of it is not guaranteed. The second necessary condition is that this free working class must have nothing else to sell but their labor. If the means of production are so evenly distributed so that this working class could simply produce on their own in a system of homestead production, they might as well not sell their labor in the first place. Not only would their position be more secure, as they would not be reliant on precarious employment, but also they would receive more for any commodity they could produce through their labor power than just selling their labor power by itself. To those of us who live in the 21st century, 200 to 600 years into the era of capitalist economic dominance, depending on where you live, these social conditions sound completely reasonable and eternal. Was there ever a time this was not the case? Of course there was, and we'll get into it in part 8 of this presentation. Nothing about these social relations that make capitalism possible are inherently natural. Capitalism has only been around for less than 1% of the entire history of the human race. If labor power is a commodity, it should have an exchange value, logically. So how is that exchange value determined? The same as any other commodity, by the socially necessary labor time required for its production, or reproduction. The exchange value of labor power is determined by the average expected cost of living of the particular group of laborers in question. If laborers under a certain set of social conditions need $30,000 a year to meet their needs on average, that is the exchange value of labor power, $30,000. The laborer takes the money they receive for selling their labor and uses it in the reproduction of their labor power so they can return to work and sell their labor power again. If salaries are below the threshold needed to reproduce labor power, the supply of workers will dwindle as workers burn out or die, and the quality of work will significantly degrade. Put simply, this is effectively the same as saying that the exchange value of labor power is the sum of the commodities the laborer needs to sustain their labor on average. So the set of commodities laborers need for the reproduction of labor power is not just the obvious cases of food, shelter, water, and other basic needs. There are other things necessary for the reproduction of labor power. Laborers need to be reimbursed for the costs of training and education needed to fill their posts. Laborers will have taken on debt or will need to pay for education in the future that allows them to fill the needs of their particular posts. And the education commodity needs to be factored into compensation, or the industry in question will quickly find itself in a shortage of qualified personnel. Secondly, laborers engage not just in the reproduction of their own labor power, but in the production of future laborers. Laborers need to be reimbursed for the expected cost of dependents, such as children, to ensure that a steady stream of labor power enters the labor market as labor power exits through death, disability, and retirement. Finally, laborers need to be kept sane. Entertainment and other commodities that sustain the mental well-being of workers must also be factored into compensation, or laborers may become dissatisfied and therefore dangerous, or they may even mentally break and become disabled. We've claimed that labor power is the commodity in the general formula for capital that allows value expansion, but we haven't actually explained why. Surely, if labor power is a commodity that produces use value, it just produces the equivalent exchange value as was received by the laborer when the labor power was purchased intuitively. But this intuition is wrong. This is not the case. The simple answer to this quandary is that the exchange value of labor power is well below the exchange value labor power is capable of generating by its consumption. How this works isn't immediately obvious. Imagine a particular ideal laborer existed outside of capitalism and even the universe. He has access to all the knowledge and means of production necessary to meet every single one of his needs. The laborer owns a farm and can produce food, but also a loom and can produce clothing. It always takes less than a full workday to produce everything that the laborer would need to reproduce their labor for the next day. This must be true, on average, as not every single person whose needs are met works. There are retired people, children, disabled people whose needs are met in some way, even though they do not expend labor power. It must always be the case that more production occurs than is necessary for the simple maintenance of those who work under any social system. Otherwise, the human race would be extinct. Laborers, however, don't sell their labor time just for the period of time it would theoretically take to reproduce their labor power. They sell it for the whole day, whole week, whole year, whole whatever period of time they've agreed upon with their employer. Whatever time beyond the basic needed expenditure of labor time of the laborer that is expended on the job is the property of the capitalist, as the capitalist has purchased the laborer's labor power for that period. This surplus labor time and the commodities produced during it are the only reliable source of surplus value, as we will explain in Part 3. With that bombshell, Marx leaves off Part 2. I'll be back for Part 3 soon, but I'll be traveling in a week and a half, so we'll see when it drops. Once again, apologies for the lack of Theory Night in Canada episode this week. We'll be back soon, I promise. Bye.